If you're just getting started with gardening because you want to grow your own food, this is a great video for you because we're talking about one of my favorite easy things to grow, lettuce. I'm Brittany from By Brittany Goldwyn. I post videos about plants and projects, and today we are going to be building some of your confidence with growing in the garden because that's what gardening is all about, and lettuce is a great crop to build your confidence on. Now, I'll be focusing specifically on lettuce for this video, but keep in mind that most of the guidance and tips I'm sharing also hold true for other greens like spinach, kale, things like that. So you'll definitely learn a lot in this video. So there are lots of reasons why I recommend lettuce as a good crop for beginners, and we'll touch on 3 of these before we get started. The first is because it is a good candidate for direct sowing. Now that just means you're planting the seeds directly in your soil. Seed starting indoors can be really overwhelming for beginners in gardening, so I recommend focusing on something like lettuce where you can just plant it outside and watch it grow. You can start starts of lettuce indoors and transplant them, but this plant does not transplant as well into the garden as something like a tomato or pepper might. Second, it has a very shallow root system and it only really needs like 5 or 6 inches of soil to grow. So this is a really good choice for container gardens if you don't have the space for a big garden. And third, lettuce can be a really expensive thing to buy at the store. If you can even find good quality lettuce that's not already all slimy, which I know we've been having a big problem with for the last year or so. So if you do it right, you can actually save some money growing lettuce. Now, when you think about gardening, you probably think about spring and summer and growing things like tomatoes, but different crops grow well in different temperatures and climates. So lettuce is a cooler season crop, meaning that it's best to plant it in the super early spring, stop planting it in the early summer, and then pick back up again, planting it for a fall garden. Now I'm in Maryland zone 7A and it's the end of February right now. And you see that I'm in sleeveless shirt and a sun hat because in the greenhouse it is 91 degrees because it is like 59 degrees and sunny outside today. So this is one of many false Maryland springs. I would not be planting lettuce outside uncovered this early. I probably would not start planting it for another couple weeks, so mid-March in zone 7A. And that's if the soil is workable and there's not a ton of snow on the ground. Now I really like using the Old Farmer's Almanac website to plug in my zip code to find the best planting dates for that, and I would highly recommend doing that if you're new to gardening as well. I will stop planting lettuce completely in my garden around late May, and I won't start again until late August. And that's because lettuce does not do well in the heat. In temperatures, even in like the mid to high 80s, it can start to get a little bitter tasting and it will start to bolt, which means it'll get taller and it will put out flowers and go to seed. So this is not what you want for your lettuce unless you want to be saving those seeds, which we'll talk a little bit about in a bit. Now I mentioned earlier that lettuce has a really shallow root system, so I really like growing lettuce in my green stalk garden. And again, it's a little bit early, but I have some radishes and some spinach in my green stalk garden, and I did just start to seed some lettuce in some of these bottom pockets. Now in a couple weeks, I'll probably roll this outside of the greenhouse because it will start warming up a little bit for my cooler weather crops. I also have been growing lettuce since about December here in these log planters in my greenhouse. I do have them on a seedling heat mat because I only run the heater at night in the greenhouse to keep it above 42 degrees. So these were super slow going all winter, but they have just really started to take off now that it's getting a tiny bit warmer some days, and mostly that the days are a little bit longer, so they're getting the light they need to grow. And here's a closer look at the soil here. You want to use something that's light and airy and well draining. If you're planting your lettuce in containers like these, just use something labeled for container use. If you're planting in raised beds or in the ground, just make sure you use a soil that's light and fluffy and amended with a nutrient-dense compost, or amend your native soil with something to add some more nutrients and break it up, especially if you're like where we are and you have a super dense clay-based soil. Now lettuce does need a decent amount of light to germinate and to grow. So I don't have any leggy lettuce plants right now to show you. I pulled them all out of my green stalk, but I will show you what a leggy spinach plant looks like because it's a very similar concept. So you can see on this spinach plant, the leaves are longer. It just doesn't look very healthy. It's a little bit scraggly looking, and that's because I had these on the other side of the greenhouse where they weren't getting that much light. So I'm hoping now that I can just trim off some of these older leaves and the newer growth will look a little bit better. Now over here you can see what some slightly healthier spinach plants look like. These were mostly transplanted from a smaller container and moved over here where I get great light. So if you notice that your plant is just generally like kind of looking unhealthy and it's getting long and it's kind of flopping over after it's sprouted, it's probably reaching for light and it needs more. Now, I mentioned that we are currently in one of many fall springs that I'm sure we will have here in Maryland, but it is a really good day to get out here and plant some of my cooler weather crops in a cold frame. Now, I said it would probably be another couple weeks before I plant outside, but that's uncovered. So I made this cold frame out of PVC pipe and wrapped plastic around it so that I can create a little greenhouse effect, especially during the day when the sun's out, to germinate and grow a little bit earlier than I would be able to without a topper. Now, I have a tutorial video showing you guys how to make this too. Super easy, super cheap, and a great way to extend your growing season. If you're growing in containers instead of raised beds, you could always just make one of these and set it over top of your containers, or use something like a storage tub if you're growing in containers that are small enough to fit inside of them, and you can carry that outside during the day. Now, in terms of the type of lettuce you're growing, I recommend looking for something that's like a butterhead or a leaf lettuce, because those you can harvest continuously while they continue to grow. You just snip off the leaves from the outside of the lettuce while new growth emerges from the middle of the lettuce. Now, I have 4 different vials here with 4 different types of seeds in them. I don't know off the top of my head what these are, but they do have numbers on them, and I have this little seed organizer that maps to a spreadsheet Google Doc where I keep track of all the different varieties. Now, planting lettuce seeds, direct sowing them in your garden, is one of the reasons why lettuce is such an easy crop to grow. You really don't have to worry too much about how deep you're burying it. It shouldn't be that deep at all. And I'm going to show you exactly how I do it here after I take the plastic off of my cold frame. Now you've got a pretty good view of the bed here, so I'll show you pretty much what I do is use a gloved hand to kind of make a little trench. And then I make the trenches roughly about, I'd say about 5 to 6 inches apart from one another. So we'll see how many of these trenches I can fit. And I generally do tend to plant things a little bit closer together than their spacing requirements because I don't have a huge garden. We just have a backyard garden, so I really try and maximize my planting space. Now, I do recommend taking your gloves off for this, because if I had $1 for every time I have spilled lettuce seeds everywhere because I was fumbling around with them with my gloves on, I don't know, I'd probably have like $5. So you don't want to bury them too deep. I'd say a good rule of thumb is probably about an inch or so. I mean, you can honestly even sprinkle them on the soil and just lightly cover them. And what you'll do after they sprout is you'll let them develop for a little bit, and then you will thin them out, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, there are spacing requirements on the backs of seed packets, but I generally recommend going with a sprinkle method down a row, because you can actually pluck out and eat the baby plants, and you're never really going to have 100% germination success, at least I don't, with direct sowing things like lettuce. So what you'll do is after they sprout and they develop some of their true sets of leaves, so each of the little plants has a couple leaves, you will then pluck them out based on whatever spacing you're going for. So for me, that's a plant roughly every 5 to 6 inches or so. But you basically overplant the lettuce seeds because they're cheap and easy to get, so that you can ensure that you have enough plants once everything germinates. So I'm just going to use my hand to just gently cover where I planted with soil. Gently pack it down. Now you will want to keep your lettuce seeds not evenly moist. They need a decent amount of moisture, to germinate and grow. Now, since I do have this in a cold frame, I have to take the top off to water it, and generally requires less water since it's a bit cooler right now. But usually when I'm watering my lettuce that's in a raised bed without a topper, because it is late enough in the season that I don't need to worry about super cold temperatures, I will just let the rain take care of things, and then if it's been a couple days without water, I will water it. I've just covered my cold frame back up, and I'm hoping you can see one of the biggest worms. Oh my gosh, you really can't tell in the video, but it's so big that it startled me. It just came out of nowhere. Hope this guy gets to work. Now I'm hoping these seeds will sprout in about 2 weeks, since it is pretty early on in the season, but I know that I'm going to generate some really good heat since they're being planted inside of my cold frame raised bed. So let's head back into the greenhouse to talk about a couple more things I want to touch on about growing lettuce before we wrap this video up. That's succession planting, pests, planting lettuce indoors, and saving seeds if that's something you're interested in doing. So first, let's talk about succession planting. If you're in the US, you can use the Old Farmer's Almanac planting calendar online to get your lettuce planting dates. You just have to plug your zip code in, like I mentioned earlier, and you can take that first planting date and plan out when you'll succession plant. So succession planting just means you are planting multiple times. And to ensure I have a steady supply of greens from very early spring to early summer, I plant a new round of lettuce seeds roughly every 2 weeks. Now, as far as seed saving goes, which I am a big fan of seed saving and sharing seeds with others, I mentioned before that if it gets too hot, your lettuce will start to bolt and flower and do what's called going to seed. Now, if you see flowers coming up, that means your lettuce is going to seed. Let the plants ride. They're done for the season. It's too hot for them. And then you can pick off the seed pods from the flowers once they die off and save those seeds to plant either for the fall or for next year. Now, lettuce is pretty vulnerable to aphids. If you notice little bugs on your lettuce, they're usually little green bugs. I find green aphids on my lettuce the most, but aphids can be a number of different colors. If you find those on your plants, try to spray them off with some water. I recommend taking an integrated approach to pest management. So I try and plant flowers and plants all around where I'm growing the food in my garden so that I can try and attract beneficial insects that help me control the pest populations that I don't want, so that I don't have to resort to using anything like pesticides. Now, since lettuce is a cooler season crop, I will say we had a huge problem with slugs and snails last spring because we had a much cooler and wetter spring here in Maryland than we have in the past. So for those, I don't treat them with anything. I tried beer traps. They didn't really do anything. So I just picked them off the plants, and if they did enough damage on a leaf, I just clipped it off. And once things dried out, all of the problems went away on their own. And finally, I want to touch on growing lettuce indoors because I know not everyone has even a patio to grow on. Lettuce makes a really great candidate for growing indoors because, like I said, it does not need super hot temperatures. It has a really shallow root system. I personally use a garden vertical growing system to grow lettuce when it is too hot or cold to grow it here. I also have a click and grow, but it is definitely possible to grow lettuce indoors without one of these fancy setups. You really just need to invest in some sort of grow light because lettuce does need a lot of light to grow. But I mean, you only need a couple inches of soil, a well-draining soil, and a relatively warm space to add that grow light to successfully grow lettuce indoors. Now, I am about to go enjoy the rest of this fall spring day in Maryland because I gotta tell you, it's really what's keeping me going these fall spring days. It's like seeing the light at the end of the tunnel of winter here in Zone 7A. I am really hoping the seeds that we just planted in my cold frame will take off soon, and then I will also be monitoring the lettuce that I've been growing over the winter here in my containers. Now, if you guys have any questions about growing lettuce, please feel free to drop them in the comments. Otherwise, happy planting!